Welcome everybody to this new Tech Talk from Agile Lab. I'm Lorenzo and I'm here with Roberto Coluccio and Max Schultze. Hi Roberto, how are you?
Hi guys, hello everyone. Good to see you, Max. Good to see you, Lorenzo. I'm Roberto, Staff Data Architect at Agile Lab. Very interested in discussing interesting things with Max.
Okay, and Max, how are you?
All good, all good. Thank you so much for bringing me in today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm Max Schultze. I'm Associate Director of Data Engineering in the data platform of HelloFresh. I've only been with the company for about 4 months now, but I'm very much focused on building data platforms and building tooling for data users across the entire organization. And even before that, I've already been working on data platforms for the past 7 years prior. So that is really like what a large part of my focus lies on.
Okay, awesome. So in this session, in this Tech Talk, I would like to start things off by talking a little bit about computational governance, since it is a very important aspect of our day-to-day job. And the first question that comes to my mind is, we've been hearing a lot about this computational governance, right? And how it is revolutionizing traditional governance methods, particularly in areas like regulatory compliance and policy management. Could you share some insights on this transformation?
Yes, absolutely. It's actually really interesting to see like how this concept is like entering a lot of organizations recently and how many organizations are dealing with this change. When I'm looking back on like how traditional data governance has been working so far, we were often coming from a setup where you had like a central team that was like making the policies and then like chasing down the different teams in the organization to make sure people are followed. Right? And nobody was really happy, neither the team that needed to be the police and chase them down, nor the teams that were forced to follow certain rules. And this is something that we've clearly seen changing here when we are talking about computational governance, but also more decentralized governance, I would say, because a lot more organizations are now moving into the direction that different teams that are producing data are taking on more responsibility around the data that they are producing. And this, of course, comes in many shapes or form, where it's not only about ownership and responsibility for just the data production itself, but also for dealing with the data and for, well, governing the data, right? And so we are actually asking a lot of teams to take on additional responsibility around governance. And that, of course, only works if we also give them the right tools for that, right? Like asking a lot of teams that did not have been involved with governance in the past to take on additional responsibility around that often means that they don't even know like how to get the job done. And it will, of course, be additional overhead for teams that are probably already overloaded. So it is really, really crucial that we provide them the right tools to actually get the job done and to make progress on that part specifically.
Yeah, totally agree, Max, on that. And I think a crucial role plays in this sense, the platform approach that an organization decide to follow when it comes to ease this being compliant to policies and regulation with no effort at all, or as less effort as possible, because eventually you can ask people to take ownership of something. If you provide them, a way of doing that easily, right? And when it comes to regulation and stuff, we have seen in the past really ineffective and inefficient data governance practices. Ineffective as they usually acted ex post, on data ex post. So data was already there. You had the data team implementing use cases. These use cases were deployed. Data was generated, and then the police, they're going around and checking out if PII were exposed, if data access was okay, to tagging the data catalog ex post once data was already there with the business terms. That's too late. That usually happens too late, thus making the practice ineffective and inefficient, because these centralized teams, which were the standard data governance team in large organizations, struggle to keep up with the pace of innovation, to keep up with the pace of data-driven business to some extent. So decentralization of ownership, also of governance, of compliance to governance, regulations, and policies cannot be just left to the people. And this is where the computational objective comes into play. So if you provide some kind of automation company-wise to be as much as possible effective and efficient to verify at design time, at deploy time, and at run time, the compliance and adherence to policies and decisions, then that's the way you can scale out your data management practice in the enterprise, in my opinion.
And Roberto, I know that you folks at Agile Lab with Witboost are also building a nice tool that actually allows people to do this in an automated way. Could you share maybe some more details about like what exactly you are building there?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I think that an important phrase wording that is going around now is metadata activation, and this is something that Witboost really enables. So the idea is that you can implement automated checks only if you have enough machine-readable information to rely on. And these machine-readable information are metadata that become active thanks to a platform. In this case, is our Witboost solution. But it's important that what metadata needs to be provided. How can teams know what are the metadata that the machine expects? And in this case, Witboost provides a templating module, so a module that provides templates ready to be used and to be composed in a very modular and technology agnostic form that already provides, the right metadata mandatory with, automated checks on with syntactical and semantic checks in order to ease, this metadata definition that becomes ownership under the ownership umbrella of the dev teams. But it's not just like, hey, there is this Word document that says you have to fill up to provide all this metadata somewhere. It's a very ease with a UI, a wizard, etc. Process that should incentivize people to follow the compliance rules. But eventually, it's not their decision anymore, as long as the platform also provides quality gates for deployment of use cases, right? So this is where also Witboost, closes the circle, as I say. So it's okay to ease the creation of this metadata. It's okay to have automated tests of this metadata, but then you also need these quality gates to prevent that things are not even deployed to the environments if they are not compliant. So even the self-set provisioning capabilities are directly linked to this stuff.
Awesome. So while you were talking, you said something like decentralized governance and concept like, okay, moving also this kind of responsibility to the dev team. So since we have been this discussion and there are this discussion ongoing about the idea of governance shift left in the data management space, could you explain that concept a little bit more, what a governance shift left is?
Yes, absolutely. The interesting part is exactly like you just highlighted, that now we are moving more to an environment where we have decentralized ownership of data, right? And specifically, we already touched upon that as well. That, of course, also means we are moving the ownership to govern the data also closer to the owners of the data because, well, you need to understand and play by the rules if you want to ensure that your data is actually treated properly, right? And when you're usually looking at like big diagrams of like how data is flowing through the organization, usually on the left-hand side you have like all the places where data is produced, and then it's trickling through the right where like ultimately it is used to actually generate insights and for decision making across the organization. And if you look at this big picture, that is like where the term governance shift left comes from, because traditionally the enforcement of governance has always been in some central place of a team that, well, really was not scalable anymore for ever larger growing organizations. So we are now moving the responsibility for that closer to the people that are actually producing and owning the data. Now, one interesting conversation that I actually really recently had was led to the thought experiment of before you shift left, you first need to shift right. And that is actually a very interesting thought. And let me explain like where that is coming from, which is coming from an angle of incentivization, right? Like Roberto, you've already touched upon it, like very briefly. We need to incentivize the people to do the right job. And that does not only come from an angle of like providing them with the right tools to get the job done in a very easy way, but also in terms of allowing them to prioritize the work that we are asking them to do. And for that, you first need to understand what is the value that your work is actually generating, right? And often the platform team or like the middle ground data producer does not really understand the end final value that your data products ultimately are generating. So first, you need to go to the right and talk to the people that are actually using the data for the final decision making, for generating the insights, to really understand the value that your data is driving, so that then you can use this information and go back upstream and say, well, see, this particular use case is generating 1 million of revenue or is steering 50 million of marketing investment on a continuous basis. So that gives then a very clear incentives also to the people on the left to prioritize the work that is required to produce good quality data, that we can ensure that these high value use cases are run on reliable data continuously.
That's interesting, and I like to also add another. It's not a metaphor, but it's another quote. I like to remind the Simon Sinek's golden circle theory. So, which says, you need this concentric system of circles that are the why, the what, and the how. And I think what Max is saying. First of all, you need the why, and this going to the business and really understanding the reason for what you're asking someone else to take ownership of means in terms of business capabilities, business requirements. So this is the why. But then it comes, the what. So what needs to be done also in terms of governance, since we're talking about this, is something that in this new paradigm is somehow split into, what are the policies, the decisions that needs to be taken in order to have a compliant practice across the organization, and this is some federated decision making that can be taken. But then the how. So how do you really implement these decisions? I think that leads to the policy as code pattern that today is becoming popular, and it's a way to automate, as we had mentioned earlier, automate the implementation and the execution of these quality checks. That shifting left also in the timeline of the creation of a use case and its deployment happen as soon as possible along the road, because the later, the worse the catastrophes that can happen, right? So again, you can go towards inefficiency and ineffectiveness as late as you go, right, in applying these even automated checks.
I love the term catastrophe.
And yeah, so you talked about how this could impact. So what are some examples where this structured computational process using governance policies could improve how data is exploited?
One of the core examples that I always love to share in this regard is data access management, right? Every company does it. Probably almost every company is also struggling with it. And it's very important that you do it the right way, because like often it starts off with some small manual processes that are working fine while you're starting your data journey in the organization, but that get outgrown very quickly. Right, like you end up in a manual hell where like people are just like reading through requests and clicking buttons like every day in and out, and you have an increasing need for people to actually get access to data. When we talk about the data that we actually want to access, of course, there's also different regulations that we need to follow, right? We are talking about things like, for instance, financial data of our organization. Not everybody should have access to this at all times, So this is something that we need to protect to certain degrees. Even more so, sensitive information about our customers, like personal identifiable information, right? It's super important that we protect that data by all means. And there's even like very, very strict regulations, for instance, the GDPR, the CCPA, that enforce protection of personal data that we strictly need to follow. So, and access management is definitely one of them, that you need to have a very specific reason on why you should be allowed to get access to data. Right? And if I'm now looking at this, like how can this actually work in a more scalable way, like more supported through automated policies, is of course coming from an angle that you, for instance, look at specific use cases, right? Like you have some use case, let's say, that is around fulfilling orders for your organization. And in that case, you have, let's say, 3 teams that are working on that use case. So it is clearly defined like who belongs to that use case. While on the other side, it is also very clearly defined on what specific data this use case needs access to actually be able to fulfill the role that it is given. Now that you have this in place as a written down policy, right? You have this particular use case for this particular purpose. You have these teams that belong to that use case, and you have this data that this use case is allowed to access. Now, a lot of things around data access management become much, much simpler, right? For instance, a new person joining one of those teams, you no longer need to run around and talk to people and create an access request and then somebody manually needs to approve. But instead, you have the policy in place. You know that team is supposed to have access to these 5 tables or data assets. So automatically, when that person joins the team, they will immediately get granted access to this data so that they can work for the same job as the rest of their team does as well. And I think this is like one very common example that clearly showcases how automated policies are bringing huge value to remove manual pain and manual processes in bigger organizations.
Yeah, so eventually data needs to be accessed by someone or something, right? So that's definitely a layer that cannot be avoided. And cannot be just left to manual operations or tickets open here and there, because that doesn't really scale out. If I can add a bit, I think that after the access management issue is addressed, then what data is accessed, and how can we make sure that data hosted by different technologies, adopting not anymore a common data model, for example, like we have seen in the usual data warehousing approaches. How can we make sure that this data still is accessible and is interoperable with other data assets, if we want to call them data products, but it's really not needed in this moment. But how can we make sure that the complexity of a large organization, when we also enable the decentralization, taking autonomy and ownership, as was said, still can have this guarantee of having data that can be correlated across different domains, different units, and different systems from a technical and semantic perspective. So in this case, I think that computational governance could play a key role by guaranteeing, at deploy time, these quality gates about, have this use case adopted this specific standard. And we are just not talking about data quality. It's way more than that. Have they adopted this standard for interoperability from a technical perspective? Have they declared what are the business terms for this data, so that from a catalog perspective, the catalog is populated right in time, and consumers can understand what are the semantic correlation keys across different domains, different data sets, that maybe they all have customer data, but they all identify this customer data with keys having the same semantic value, but having different namings in terms of columns. So did they provide the semantic linking of the business concept among all these different namings? And when you start decentralizing, these are issues that cannot be just avoided. In the regular data warehousing approach, you have one central system and one common data model that everyone needs to be compliant with, so that you have these things out of the box with a lot of complexity, because go there and change one column, you are stuck. So these are the challenges that are being addressed by the decentralization. But if with great power comes great responsibilities and great challenges, these are one of the ones that can be addressed with an automated approach, an automation-driven approach.
So I think it was a very interesting conversation. I would like to thank Roberto for being here. And I would like to thank also Max for being here. I hope to see you again. And maybe in a future tech talk, we can continue talking about data governance and data mesh, or some more interesting things as well. Thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
See you.
Yeah, as well on my side. So Max, always interesting to talk with you. And every time new things pop up just by talking. So it's always interesting. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. See you.